Hey guys, so this is our last histology video. Remember, there were four tissue types that we have discussed so far. We talked about epi, and we talked about connective tissue, and last video was muscle, and this is our last but not least video on nervous tissue. So our nervous system can be found in the brain, spinal cord is central nervous system, and the peripheral is everything coming off the brain and spinal cord, our peripheral nervous system. So that is the tissue that we will be talking about in this video. So in nervous, we have different types of connective tissue that go around the different areas, similar to muscle. So remember in muscle, we talked about the different mysiums, and we had epi and peri and endomysium. Now we have very similar things, except now they are going to be called neurium. And so we have endoneurium. We have epi, let's write it down, neurium, and that goes around everything. So just like our epimysium that ran around muscle, epineurium is going to go around all of it. And remember last time in muscles, we talked about we had bundles where we had multiple cells packed together in a bundle called a fascicle. We have the same thing happening here with nerves. Nerves can be bundled in fascicles, and those fascicles are going to be surrounded by a connective tissue, and that connective tissue is going to be perineurium, just like perimysium, except for nerves, perineurium. So number two is this stuff. So here's our bundle, here's our fascicle of nerves. All right, here's another fascicle of nerves. And then here's another fascicle. All of these that have number 3 are fascicles. This one does not have a number, but it's another fascicle. And between them, again, perineurium. Perineurium is going to be around the bundle of it. And then if we zoom in on it, we are going to have endoneurium that is going to be surrounding an individual nerve. So it is this guy. If we look real close, that number 6 is going to be endoneurium that goes around a whole nerve. But we haven't even talked about what a whole nerve looks like yet. So I stole this image from OpenStax to show you a really good drawing of what a nerve looks like. Thank you, OpenStax. So on our nerve, this is normally we talk about motor neurons and PNS. This is a CNS nerve because it's got, I know it is because it's got an oligodendrocyte instead of a Schwann cell, but it has basic components on a nerve. So the basic components on your nerve are going to be these little guys coming in. These guys are dendrites. They take information in, they receive information in. Dendrites, that information is all transferred to this area right here in the middle. That's the soma, also called the cell body. Soma or cell body right here. That's going to house the nucleus. Nucleus is always going to be in the cell body. Nucleus. And then extending off of that soma is going to be this extension, and there's always only one, and it's called an axon. So here's our axon, and this guy extends all the way down until eventually it ends up at these terminal bulbs that are going to synapse with either another nerve or a muscle cell or a gland at the end that they will synapse with. But we got this big long piece right here that is an axon. And our nerves, their job is to communicate, right? That is the whole point of our nervous system, is to send signals and communicate. So in order to do that, our nerves are going to be insulated, just like the wires that you are charging your cell phone with, and you're charging your tablet and your computer, all run off of electricity and wires, and those wires are insulated. So too are your nerves. Your nerves are insulated. And so those guys are insulated with something called myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is this protein that is released by these cells. And depending on if you're in the peripheral nervous system or the central nervous system will have an oligodendrocyte. Peripheral nervous system will have a Schwann cell, but they basically are doing the same thing. They're releasing this protein called myelin, and it wraps around and around and around and around, kind of like a snail shell. Is this myelin as it wraps around, and it can go around just one connective tissue around that, and it is going to be endoneurium. So all of this around this one individual nerve is endoneurium, and we can pick it up around here. So if we look around the edge of that one guy, this is the endoneurium, and that little dark spot in the middle, and I'm not going to touch it because if I touch it, I'll cover it up. The dark spot in the middle is the axon. That's the axon, and the light stuff surrounding it is going to be the myelin sheath that is produced by these different cells, oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells, the insulation that goes around an individual cell. So to recap, we have connective tissue around the entire nerve, the whole thing coming down, like your whole sciatic nerve, epineurium going around the whole thing. And then we had fascicles where we had things bundled up together. So we had fascicles, and those things had connective tissue around them, and that was the perineurium. And then if we looked at an individual nerve and it is surrounded by myelin sheath around the axon, that is endoneurium, and the endoneurium is this number 6. It is going around the axon, and it's kind of insulated in there. The insulation is the myelin sheath, and that is endoneurium going around the outside of that myelin sheath there. The axon is going to be the dark spot. So if you look at number 4 and you follow the arrow, you can see that little dark spot at the very, very center of this. So here's the outside of it, and on the inside of this little circle is a dark spot, and that's the axon right there. The little light coloring in between the dark spot and this outer circle. So if it was like, I don't know how to describe it, like this, the little apple pencil, the apple pencil would be the axon of the nerve, and then the space around that, this space around it, would be insulated with myelin sheath that's going all around the axon, and then covering that whole thing is endoneurium on the outside. So we can make out all of that on this histology slide, where we've got the axon, the myelin sheath that goes around it, and the endoneurium that goes around the nerve, the whole nerve, all the way down. That is that slide. Here is a beautiful slide of some motor neurons. And so on this image, we are going to have some neurons. Here's our nucleus, right smack in the middle. And we said, what's the area that holds the nucleus? It's going to be called the soma, or the cell body. So all of this darker stuff here, that's your soma and your cell body. We are going to have things that come off of that. But in this slide, it's really hard to determine what you are looking at. Are you looking at dendrites, or are you looking at axons? And you just can't tell. I cannot tell on this slide. So we have all of these extensions, these processes coming off, but are these dendrites, are these the axon? I can't tell. It's hard to say. So we just have them labeled as nerve cell processes because we don't know if those are dendrites or axons in this slide image. But do be able to recognize, please be able to recognize that this is the cell body and that this is the neuron, nucleus of that neuron. There's also other cells. Your nervous system is here for your whole life. Your central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, those cells are there for a long, long time. And you need helper cells, best friends that keep these guys going. And they do all sorts of super cool things like blood-brain barrier, getting things that don't belong out of the way, all sorts of cool stuff. And those best friend cells are called neuroglial cells. So that's these little guys over here. All of these are the besties of the neurons. So all these little smaller things, you can make out these little nuclei, kind of like they look like speckles all around the edges. Those are all the best friends. Those are all the neuroglial cells that support your neurons of your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. What else we got? Our last one is going to be our spinal column. So on the spinal column, you can absolutely make out that there is dark gray stuff and there is light stuff. So remember we talked about myelin sheath that insulates the axon. The myelin sheath is going to show up as this light area, the light stuff. So that's going to be the white matter. And the area where the soma was, the cell body, remember that didn't have all the myelin sheath around them. And so that stuff was darker colored. And so that's going to be the gray matter. So we got gray matter. All of this is the gray matter. And then all of this stuff is the white matter, all this lighter stuff. So let's knock that out. Gray matter and white matter. On the gray matter, you do need to know, are you looking at the anterior side or the posterior side? Because they have horns, anterior horn and a posterior horn. How I figured that stuff out is, how am I looking at the anterior or the posterior side of the gray? There are grooves on the spinal column in the white matter. So if we're looking at this white matter, check it out. So we've got white matter, it comes along, and we've got a little notch right here. So there's a little bit of a dip in. This dip is a sulcus because it's kind of shallow. So it's a sulcus, and this is on the posterior side. So this is the posterior median sulcus. It's labeled number 6 here on this slide image. Posterior median sulcus. It's a shallow little dip on the posterior side. So if this is the posterior median sulcus, then that means that this has to be the posterior horn of gray. This is also a posterior horn of gray. So these are both posties over here. If we follow the white matter around to this side, if that's posterior median sulcus, then this guy is got to be the anterior side. And the anterior side, its groove is really deep. I know it's kind of hard to make out, but it is really dark. If you see this dark gray line that comes in, that is super deep, and it's a fissure because it's deeper than the sulcus. So this is the anterior median fissure on the anterior side. So it was posterior on the side, anterior on the side. Number 7 is our anterior median fissure. And if this is the anterior side, this means that this has to be the anterior horn of gray. Anterior horn of gray. On this guy, it's kind of hard to make out. Some of these guys are better than others. Some slides are better than others. But there are also lateral horns that stick off to the side. Occasionally, they're really prominent. Other slides, not so much. This one, not so much. But do know your white matter, your gray matter. The white matter is going to have 2 places where it dips in. One of them is shallow, so it's a sulcus, the posterior median sulcus, abbreviated PMS. I hope that sticks with you. And then we have the anterior median fissure because it's super deep. So this big groove right here is the anterior median fissure, anterior side, anterior horn of gray over here. So I think that the gray matter itself, to me, looks a little bit like a butterfly, sort of. It looks like it's got 2 wings, and it's, there's a little body of the butterfly that connects it. So the body of it that is going to connect is going to be our gray commissure. That's this stuff. The gray part that connects the 2 wings is the gray commissure. And then if you look in the gray commissure, there's a hole, there's a little canal. And so this is our central canal. It's number 3 over here. It's not labeled over here, but the hole is the central canal. And so there's a little bit of fluid that goes through that central canal. So we've got central spinal fluid that wraps around the brain, and it wraps all the way down the spinal cord. If anybody's ever heard of a spinal tap, they're looking at that central spinal fluid, and that fluid also flows in this little central canal. So this little hole is the central canal. The gray matter that connects the 2 wings together is the gray commissure. And then do know the 2 wings of gray matter. There's a posterior side and an anterior side. And occasionally on a slide, it will dip out and you'll see a lateral horn of gray too. What else do we have? We said that this was the PMS and this was the AMF over here. So that's given us our reference. Always look for those groups. If you can find the real deep fissure, you're on the anterior side. AMF over here, posterior over here. On the posterior side is also called the dorsal side. Dorsal. And this, if that's dorsal, then that means that your anterior side has to be ventral. On the dorsal side, we are going to have information coming in on our dorsal root. So we have our dorsal root. We got this little nerve here. We're going to have a ganglia that comes in and it connects into here. So we are going to have our dorsal root and our dorsal root ganglia coming in. Here's our ganglia because it's kind of a big chunky bit, and then it kind of thins out and goes a little bit skinnier as it heads in. The ganglia is going to be kind of a big section that it does chunk out a little bit. It'll be like skinny little nerve, and then it'll be like where they kind of meet and collide, and come together, and it's going to be this kind of chunkier area. That'll be a ganglia. You got a dorsal root ganglia on the spinal cord in this slide. And on our models, you'll see the chain ganglia going down the entire spinal column for our sympathetic nervous system, the chain ganglia. They're also going to be these chunky bits. So here's our chunky bit. Number 9 is our dorsal root ganglia with our dorsal root coming in over here. This little skinny bit, it's real thin, but that's going to be the ventral right there. Our ventral root coming off. So be able to recognize the spinal cord. Know if you're, for reference, are you looking at the posterior side, the anterior side? The shallow dip is the sulcus, PMS, posterior median sulcus. The big deep groove is a fissure, so that's the anterior median fissure. And now you know your reference point. This is the posterior side, this is the anterior side. You can label your horns of gray. If you need the lateral one, you can label your gray commissure, central canal. If you're on the posterior side, then you're definitely on the dorsal side, which means there's our root ganglia, and here's the dorsal root coming in. If that's the dorsal side, then this side has to be ventral, and here's our ventral root over there. So those are the histology parts that we need to know for the spinal cord, and our neurons, the different type of neurium that goes around them, be able to recognize that as well, the parts of the neuron. So I hope this helps with your nervous system histology. Have a great day.